This podcast is brought to you by the Prospect Research Institute, where researchers come to learn, innovate, and connect.
You have many more living donors who've made a great deal of money, often in some controversial ways, who are arriving on the scene with very deep pockets. And people are taking a more critical look at them these days than in the past because we live in an age where there's rising concern about economic inequality. There's a growing backlash against the super rich. And that backlash is playing out in the philanthropic world.
Welcome to Prospect Research Chat Bites, a podcast by and for prospect research professionals. I'm Jennifer Filla. Today, I'm talking with David Callahan, founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy, and author of The Givers: Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. Hello, David. Thank you for joining me today on Chat Bites.
It's great to be here.
So before we dive into our topic today of ethical and moral issues around Mega-Philanthropy, I'm hoping that you might be willing to share a little bit about yourself and how you arrived in the philanthropy space.
I spent 20 years in the nonprofit space as a person who worked at think tanks. I co-founded the think tank Demos in New York, and I spent a lot of time chasing grants, mainly from foundations, but also from individual donors. And I found the process very frustrating, extremely time-consuming, and continually head-scratching. And I wondered, what does it take to get inside these foundations and to figure out how they operate? And how do you identify these individual donors and get a coffee date with them? And so that was one reason I was interested in getting into the philanthropy space and starting Inside Philanthropy. The second reason was that I was very interested and remain so in the power of philanthropy and how much influence these donors have and that foundations have, and what impact that influence is having on our society. And so I started Inside Philanthropy in 2014, so over 5 years ago, and have been closely immersed in this space ever since.
You put out great stuff on Inside Philanthropy. I have to confess I'm a fan. Good things happen there, and a subscriber, so there's that.
Excellent.
And I'm also a big fan of your book, The Givers. And I think I'm not alone in the prospect research world with that. I know you've written many other books, but that one really speaks to me as a researcher of people and philanthropists in particular, because you came up with all those wonderful categories and really dig into the motivations for why those people were giving the way they were. How long did it take to research and write a book like that?
A lot of that book really came out of the research and writing for Inside Philanthropy. Before I wrote that book, we had already been spending a couple of years digging into donors from tech and donors from Wall Street, digging into some of these young heirs coming onto the scene who were inheriting family fortunes. So the book really drew a lot from work that I had already been doing. And then, the book itself took maybe a year or so to write, and I did a number of interviews for the book, and it was a really interesting experience.
I'll bet it was. I'll bet just doing the research was head spinning.
Absolutely. And as you know, it can be kind of hard to get access to some of these philanthropists. They often feel like there's really nothing in it for them to talk to a writer or somebody in the media, and many of them are quite guarded. They're very private, and it can be hard to just know what they're doing because they often take steps to cover their tracks and obscure where their money is going. And so it's a little bit of a detective job to get inside the minds of these donors and to figure out how they ticked and what they were funding, and also to get a sense of the processes that they use to kind of guide their giving.
So what were you hoping when you were writing the book that the fundraising field would get out of it? or who was your audience, I guess, when you were
I
writing it?
guess I had multiple audiences in writing the book. I definitely wanted to speak to the broader general public and to explain this whole world of philanthropy and why it was really worth paying attention to the rise of these new billionaire donors right now, because they are more numerous, they do have more money, they are getting more sophisticated in how they're deploying philanthropic wealth for influence. And all of that new kind of momentum around big philanthropy is coming at the same time that government is in retreat, that the public sector has fewer dollars, that public agencies are less able to solve problems. So private philanthropy is stepping forward as government steps back, and I think that is a very troubling phenomenon in many ways, and that's sort of the larger story of the book. For the kind of professional fundraisers and the people in the nonprofit world, I wanted them to just get a better sense of who these people are, these new philanthropists, and how, in particular, how they made their money influences how they give, right? So you have people coming into philanthropy at a very large level from different kinds of professional experiences and industries. The tech people and the finance people often think quite differently from each other, and in turn, they might think differently than the you know old industry moguls who've made their fortunes over many decades. And so I really wanted to kind of offer a kind of explanation of this new fundraising and philanthropy terrain, a kind of large, big picture look at what's happening in terms of the shape, how philanthropy is being reshaped by all these new individual donors coming onto the scene.
Well, a lot of this makes sense now that you've talked about your background and that you were a grant seeker as well, because you're understanding how difficult it is to accomplish a nonprofit mission, and you know dependent upon these philanthropists who can be cryptic and obscure. So, moving forward with the fundraising field, with the public a little more educated about where the wealth is coming from and some of the motivations that differ among that, there's also sort of this ethical and moral edge to some of your writing, either in the book or in Inside Philanthropy. And that fascinates me because whenever someone makes a huge gift, whenever there's some backlash, like Malcolm Gladwell recently, or not too recently, but has had some backlash against some of the mega gifts maybe not being given in the best way, the fundraising field kind of puts up their hands and says, any gift is a good gift. But sometimes they're not so sure. And I think the Sackler family is a recent example of that, where the money was linked to the opioid crisis, and suddenly it's not okay, maybe, to take the money. What's your perspective on untangling that kind of hot mess? How do you walk the line between saying it's good money or bad money, for simplicity's sake?
I think this is a great example of how philanthropy is changing, because you have many more living donors who've made a great deal of money, often in some controversial ways, who are arriving on the scene with very deep pockets, and people are taking a more critical look at them these days than in the past, because we live in an age where there's rising concern about economic inequality. There's a growing backlash against the super rich, and that backlash is playing out in the philanthropic world. And the Sacklers are a great example of that, but there are others as well.
Sure.
Some of the people who are made their money on Wall Street in questionable ways, or obviously the backlash against the Koch brothers and their conservative agenda has been going on for a while. And it certainly complicates the terrain for people who are raising money for large institutions. In particular, universities have been caught up in a number of these toxic donor controversies. major museums, cultural institutions, the kinds of places that the richest of the rich gravitate to are most likely to find themselves embroiled in these controversies.
So when your writers at Inside Philanthropy are working on these kinds of stories, you're editing, what approach are you taking? Are there guidelines for, when someone's stepping into maybe more emotional territory, or how do you stay balanced when reporting on this stuff?
Well, I give my writers one rule, which is be interesting, which is to say that I think that philanthropy can be a really boring subject, and that I often describe our mission at Inside Philanthropy to make philanthropy as interesting as it actually is. And so we're always looking for the angle that is kind of thought provoking, or we're looking to find some insight that we can share with our readers. And one reason we've done a lot of coverage of these toxic donors is because that's just interesting. It's an interesting tension between nonprofits really needing money to fulfill their mission and increasingly being asked to scrutinize the donors who provide that money. And I don't think that there are not easy answers to some of these questions. If you start asking about how people made their money, well, yeah, on the one extreme, there's the Sacklers, and you want to put them off limits. You don't want their name on your museum. But, what about somebody who made their money in fossil fuels, or made their money in banking and offered predatory loans, like many of these mainstream banks, right? We're always looking at Inside Philanthropy for the stories that will get people thinking, and we don't want to just present things in too simplistic of a manner that strip away the nuance.
I love it. You want to get people thinking and you want to be interesting. That's a good combination.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so you're looking at organizations, they need this money for their missions, as you said, and they're focusing a lot on major gifts. It used to be 80-20, and now it's just, way off kilter. I mean, we might have 95-5 or even less of a difference there. Have you noticed anything in fundraising practices that might be contributing to that, or do you feel it's more just the economics driving fundraisers?
I think it's very worrisome the way in which the smaller donors are disappearing and more money is coming from the larger donors. It reflects this overall upward tilt in society, that as all the income gains have gone to the top 10% of the income spectrum, it's not surprising that, hey, those are the people with money. They're the people who can afford to make gifts. Meanwhile, most U.S. households are treading water, and they're less able to make charitable gifts than in the past. And so you have nonprofit institutions that are increasingly re-gearing their fundraising efforts around going for those large donors, which means that this is yet one more part of our society that is kind of beholden to the wealthy, focused on what the upper class is thinking and how to please them. And I think that's troubling.
Yeah, it's always really tempting to say, well, if I just had 5 donors at 1 million, I'd have my $5 million wing or building or campaign done. It's much more difficult now to find those middle donors who can make reasonably large gifts, but they're the 10, the 25, the 100,000, the 500,000. And I wonder, I don't know if there's any research out there. I haven't seen any looking at fundraising practices for that group of donors. Like, have we just stopped asking? Or
No. There's still plenty of hustle after those donors. I think it's really the smaller donors below that where the biggest fall off has been. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who can afford to make, 10, 20, 50, $100,000 gifts. In America today, there are 75,000 households with assets over $30 million, liquid assets, not including their real estate. That's a lot of prospects out there with some serious cash. But, it's the smaller donor, the universities, for example, the kind of rank and file alumni who are not giving as much. And there's been this long downward trend in ordinary Americans making charitable gifts. And that, of course, is likely to be exacerbated by the new tax law passed in 2017. I think that is forcing changes in how nonprofits raise money.
Yeah, I would agree. Totally. There's also been some changes in how philanthropists are giving away their money. Is that something that you feel is also an interesting topic for this conversation of fundraising? And by how, I'm of course thinking of things like donor advised funds, which limit our ability to know where those gifts are going.
Well, I think that the biggest change has been in the focus on impact among donors, particularly young donors, who really want to make sure that their money gets the biggest bang for the buck. And so legacy institutions in the world of the arts, higher education, these sort of blue chip nonprofits that for decades have done extremely well with wealthy donors, I think are now starting to face some new challenges, because a lot of these younger donors and impact-oriented donors, particularly from tech and finance, they don't want to just write the big check to the Philharmonic or to Harvard University. They're not saying, "Oh, my alma mater is the obvious place to make a big gift anymore." And these younger donors are instead thinking, "Hey, how do I move the needle on global health? Or how do I give money to ensure that more third graders know how to read?" And so that presents some challenges for legacy institutions that now need to demonstrate their social utility and their impact in ways that they weren't being asked to in the past.
Well, I have to say, your book, The Givers, is a nice guide, especially if you draft your own kind of cliff notes to keep track, because it does help to look at, cohorts of philanthropists. And then you can look at that kind of trend, like what type of philanthropist does my institution rely on now, and how might that change in the future? That's
right. I think that institutions can construct a kind of thermometer of the kinds of donors who are likely to be more or less warm or cold toward their mission. So I say, when I speak to university fundraisers, I say, look, many philanthropists can be arrayed along this thermometer. Some are really cold towards higher ed institutions because they don't see those institutions as being very efficient or as having a lot of social impact. And those donors who are interested in getting the most bang for their buck and taking on something like malaria or illiteracy, they're not going to be very warm to making a big gift to a college or a university. On the other hand, the kind of less impact-oriented, often older donor who's maybe less sophisticated or focused on social justice, has very warm feelings towards their time on campus, like that person's in the hot zone for you. And I think that in terms of the likelihood of a major gift. And I think that a lot of institutions can construct that same sort of thermometer and try to imagine what kinds of individuals are most likely to be at the different places on that thermometer.
I think that's great advice, whether they do that through analytics or even anecdotally, but being in touch and knowing who their donors are and why they want to give to them is pretty critical, mission critical.
Right. Like I used to raise money for a progressive public policy think tank, right? That the kind of person who was warm toward our mission would probably be quite different from the kind of person who's warm toward making a big gift to a major university, right? It's, we're much edgier, more scrappy institution as opposed to a kind of blue chip name brand with a lot of prestige. And, you don't want to waste your time running after the wrong people.
So bringing it all back to prospect research and the rise of these mega donors, which is where research tends to focus. We focus mostly on major gifts, except at the smaller end of the nonprofit spectrum where we support everything. But when we're looking at major gifts and philanthropists, do you have any advice for performing that research, presenting that research to our development officers, either in terms of reputational risk or any due diligence we should do, but also just things like being interesting?
We always pay a lot of attention when we're researching philanthropists at Inside Philanthropy. We pay a lot of attention to how people made their money and the mores and kind of norms within the industry that they're coming out of. Because I think that those experiences are so formative for people. They've spent years in some particular industry, which has its worldview. And as they turn to philanthropy, they're going to bring that kind of thinking with them. The tech philanthropists are a great example. These people have spent their careers, often not even many years. A lot of them are young in industries that are, in a tech world that is super focused on disruption, right? It's all about you make your money in technology by coming up with some new idea or product or service that nobody has thought of, and which ideally blows up some existing industry like taxi cabs or hotels or travel agents or whatever, right? And that's how you make your fortune, and often those fortunes are made quickly. And so when those people turn to philanthropy, they're often interested in nonprofits that are promising some sort of disruption to advance social change. In contrast, somebody who made their money over many decades in a kind of more traditional old economy industry, they're more likely to have warm feelings towards institutions and be believers in institutions that are part of the community and have been around for a long time. So those are sort of two very different kinds of donors, and they're different because of where they came from in terms of how they made their money. So that's the thing that we look at most closely. Of course, another thing that you always want to look at is the spouse. And in many cases, people's attention is all focused on the person who made the money, often the guy who's been out in some industry like finance, piling up some fortune, and all the attention is on that person. But actually, it's their wife who's doing the active giving, and that's the person you really need to be paying attention to. And so those are just two things that kind of inform how we look at these folks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing today. I really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
That was David Callahan, founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy and author of The Givers: Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode. And if you want to be interesting and get people thinking the way David and his crew at Inside Philanthropy do, become a member at the Prospect Research Institute. Join us for our monthly masterclass where we come together to share how we work and how to apply new ideas in our offices. Work your way through on-demand courses and earn digital badges to showcase your new skills on sites like LinkedIn. Visit www.prospectresearchinstitute.org to learn more.